This is only for a few minutes. A friend and colleague of mine, whose name is Nancy Gershman, you see it up there, has devised this process that she uses with the bereaved and people who have had losses of a more intangible, ambiguous kind, of a kind that many of us have experienced and with which we work. And what she does is this. Nancy is not a psychologist, she is not a social worker, she is not a business consultant, she calls herself a memory artist. And the goal of a kind of healing dreamscape is to help you construct the memory you needed instead of just the one you had. Now what she'll do then is a kind of sensitive interview, and we don't have time to really model or display this, but she'll ask questions a little bit like some of the questions that I asked An and that you asked one another as we did that career construction interview, kind of an appreciative inquiry into the story of your life, allowing you to kind of tell that story, listening for the hard parts of it as well, the kind of broken pieces, the difficult losses and transitions that still haunt us. And then to attempt to brainstorm, to kind of fantasize and create a factual and or wish-based narrative, a preferred story about that time of our lives, or in the case of bereavement, right, about the deceased person, the dead person, in a way that resonates with our emotional truth. In other words, it might depart from the literal truth of, let's take the example of someone who has died, depart from the literal truth of that person's life, but embody a kind of emotional truth, a narrative truth. So for example, in this case, the woman's mother has died. This is a picture of the mother from her wedding picture. Her name was Phyllis, and she had one wonderful year when she was able to be a playwright, someone who wrote plays. But then she married, and in the 1950s, women didn't have careers if they were married very much in the United States, and so the career was given up. Well, in the healing dreamscape, of course, you can kind of make it real and preserve that aspect of Phyllis's identity. They find a photograph in the family photo album that captures Phyllis at a moment of joy. This is in the context of her wedding. They use Photoshop, right, to crop that picture out, to construct an image here, changing the position of her arms, putting a little polar bear in her lap, putting an old-fashioned typewriter behind her, and a kind of landscape that was featured in one of the plays that she wrote. So you find props, supporting elements, to stand for the missing imagery. So you may look at images on the internet to bring forward different elements, and you put together and observe then with what Nancy calls a comedic intelligence, meaning that there's often something a little whimsical or funny about it that gives it a little emotional punch and that captures something, in this case, the woman's image of her mother, as vital, as creative, as connected, as a little unusual, in a way that then gives her pleasure and joy as she sees the image. It is a very interesting practice and one that finds a lot of value in helping people connect with who they loved and lost in a new or maybe a familiar but displaced way, but also to connect with who they were compassionately. So it kind of has that function too. In a focus on the real memories and drawing close to those and having them witnessed, finding an audience for those stories, we can easily forget the healing role of imaginary stories. And we can fail to recognize that therapy is not only about rational reconstruction of our memories, right, but it is about imaginative construction of future possibilities. And so what we do with virtual dream stories, which have this name because they are virtually dreamlike. They're a little surreal, like dreams are sometimes surreal. They introduce sometimes counterfactual, impossible figures into the narration. They may be a little bit like fairy tales for children, for example. We might use these kinds of narrative forms in order to address loss in a different way. These are brief, improvisational stories that are written in 8 minutes, right? A very short period of time. They are prompted, usually, by a series of elements or figures just that provide a basic scaffold or structure for the story that the person then builds on. You'll see what I mean when we do it 3 minutes from now. We can then process this with partners or with a coach or therapist in ways that are useful. Can we imagine that both would be equally useful in coaching or counseling? In one case, maybe symbolically beginning to conjure sources of resilience. In another case, being able to access what feels deep and unfinished and a difficult emotion that requires attention and recognition.